Okay. Well, I am not sure whether or not this is going to work because last time I did this, it was an absolute disaster. So that was fun. Um, but I am over at my parents' house and I am hoping that the internet over here is a little bit better. So we will see. Um, all right. Well, a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I started doing these live streams, and it really was pretty much just as bad as it could possibly be. My internet was just terrible, and let's see. I'm hoping that this works, but I don't know. Maybe it's not working. Man, I just don't know what I'm doing. Can you tell? It's okay though. See what we can do. But I started this because I have some family friends that are in Missouri, in Kansas City, Missouri, and they, I'm sorry, I'm still trying to set this up. They are really, really cool people. Let's see. Okay, so start sending okay. So where? One viewer. Okay, I don't know. I'm not sure if this is actually working. Oh, there's Dan. So Dan, is this working? Hey. Oh, thank you. Okay, I got somebody to bring me my water bottle. All right. So the reason I'm mostly doing this is because Dan asked me to, and he's here, and I think Edie's here too. So my mom says the volume is very low. Let me see if I can get that a little bit better. Sweet. So this is still all a little bit of an experiment. I don't know. Let's see. Is that better? Does that give you a little bit more volume? I can probably give you, let's see. I'm going to wait for my mom to tell me whether or not the volume on that is pretty good. Okay, so let's see here. Sweet. Okay, so Dan asked me if I would do a little bit of a, okay, she says it's better. Dan asked me if I would do a little bit of work on the genealogies in Genesis. We had talked a little bit about the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, which is mentioned in Genesis, and then it's sort of just not mentioned again in those particular terms. And so there are a lot of people who are looking at that and they're saying, okay, well, what exactly is this seed of the serpent, seed of the woman? And there is a connective tissue all the way throughout the whole entire scriptures for the children of God, the sons of God, who are also called the sons of the woman in this particular context. And I'll make a case for that. But there's also a case to be made that there are children of the devil or the seed of the serpent. And so let's go through a little bit of this. And forgive me if I don't have all my references right in front of me, but all this stuff can be checked. But let's begin at after the fall. The serpent obviously was the instrument that was used in order to deceive Eve and cause the fall of humankind. Okay, so the promise that God gives actually to Eve of sorts, but through the serpent, because it's part of the curse on the serpent, is he says that there will be enmity, that he will set enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and that the serpent, the seed of the serpent, will crush the heel of the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman will crush the head of the seed of the serpent. And so after that, you're kind of like, okay, well, where does this go? Like, what is happening from there? Because those words aren't necessarily used, but there is a connective tissue here. So right after that, after the fall of humankind and sort of the pronouncement of judgments on the serpent and on the woman and on the humankind, you have this, there's a series of genealogies after Cain. So you have Cain and Abel, the story of Cain and Abel. And it's pretty obvious that Cain, biologically speaking, is the child of Adam and Eve. It says that Adam knew his wife and she conceived and she gave birth to a son, and the son is Cain. So if you're looking at that and you're saying, okay, so the seed of the woman here is Cain. That's the first child from Adam and Eve. Well, Eve probably thought that, and that's why she named him Cain, the acquired one. She says, because with the help of Yahweh, I have acquired a son. And so they named his name Cain, which means acquired, or the acquired one. So he was like the really important dude. I'm pretty sure that Eve probably thought this was the answer to the prophecy that had been given in terms of the seed of the woman, who would be ruling over, or crushing the serpent, kind of like getting some sort of like victory for the vengeance or something like that. I don't know exactly what she thought, because this is like first humans, and at this point I don't even know how old they are, how much experience they have, but it's pretty obvious she thinks Cain is it. And part of the reason why it's obvious that that's the case is because if you're looking at Abel, the name Abel, Chabel, actually means breath, but it comes to mean basically nothing. Like literally nothing, like to mean nothing or little or basically unimportant. And the reason we know that's the case is because you can see in Ecclesiastes when the term Hebel is used, and it's translated in most translations, vanity. So vanity of vanities is Hebel Hebelim. So it's like that, Abel, it's the Abel of Abels, vanity of vanities. And so Abel is this like vanity. He's a nothing. He's kind of an afterthought. And Eve might have even thought, like, why do we need Abel if we've got Cain? If Cain is going to answer the issue of the vengeance on the serpent that needs to happen, the crushing of his head. Well, Cain turns out to be not a great guy. If you know the story, he murders his brother Abel, and clearly is the seed of the serpent. So even though he is biologically born of Adam and Eve, he's operating actually within the family of the serpent. And then after the story of Cain and Abel, you have these two genealogies that are given. One is the genealogy of Cain and the children of Cain, and the other is the genealogy of Seth, who was given, the name Seth kind of means appointed or set, and he is set in place of, or given in place of, Abel. So Abel died, and Seth is the replacement for Abel. So you have the line of Seth, and then you have the line of Cain. Okay, so you look at these, and the genealogies are very interesting because they kind of have, genealogies are one of those things where you're reading and you're saying, this is not an important thing. It doesn't really matter. You kind of skip over it. It's a lot of names. They're hard to pronounce, etc. But the genealogy in this case is actually really important because what you see on the side of Cain is that the children of Cain are important people. Especially when you get to the seventh in the line, which is Lamech. Now, an important thing about the seventh is it's usually the number of completion, it's the number of perfection, which you can see used as symbolically throughout the scriptures. So Lamech is sort of the epitome or perfection of Cain. And it's made obvious that he is by the fact that he is a powerful man and a murderer. He says, I've killed a man for insulting me. I've killed a child for harming me. So he's a murderer. He's a really, really lame dude. But he even connects himself to Cain and says, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, you see there the seven again, then I will be avenged 77-fold. So he explicitly marks himself in the line of Cain and proves himself also to be part of the seed of the serpent, because the seed of the serpent is ultimately those that use power in order to accomplish their purposes rather than submitting to the will of God. Okay. Yeah, Lamech. That's right. Thanks, Abby. All right. So Lamech is the seventh in that line, the perfection of Cain, and in a sense, the completion of the spirit of Cain, which is the power, the way of the serpent, the seed of the serpent. But his children are all really important. Metallurgist, inventor of musical instruments, an inventor of agriculture, herdsman, and also you have the only woman who's named in either of these genealogies, which is Naamah. Now, Naamah is it means bright or beautiful. Okay, so that's going to be important here in a second. Now, if you go over to the line of Seth, unlike the line of Cain, is not the line of power. In fact, if you go to the seventh from Adam, in the line of Seth, what you have is instead of the completion of power or like great people, you have Enoch. Now, Enoch walked with the Lord and was no more. That's what he's famous for. He's famous literally for being so righteous he ceased to exist. So this is not like a mover and shaker. This is not a power broker. This is not a person who murders people. This is not a person who has his way. This is not a person who accomplishes great things, acquires many wives, acquires lots of property. This is not a city builder. All of Cain's children are city builders. They're makers of things, inventors, important people, influencers. These are the people that everybody would look to and say, these are the important people. The people in the line of Seth are nobodies. I mean, Abel himself was a nobody. He was a herder, just a shepherd, and he died, so that's not usually something that people are like, yeah, I want to die too, like that guy. That's how I want to go. And then all of his children too are kind of, nobodies in the world, in the early ancient world. And the perfection of that line is Enoch, who ceases to exist. He's so righteous. Okay, so he's in the line of Hebel, the vanities, the nothings, the throwaways, the overlooked ones, the weak ones, the ones who don't really make a name for themselves on the earth. And so you look at that and you're like, okay, but he's one of the sons of God in the sense that he is actually a doer of the will of God. He obeys God so faithfully that he ceases to exist. Well, his son is Methuselah. Methuselah, the name Methuselah is a prophecy. We know that Enoch is a prophet from the book of Jude. It says that Enoch had prophecies. One of the prophecies is actually mentioned in Jude. That's probably a topic for another podcast, or another live stream or whatever. Anyway, but Enoch has a prophecy in the name of his son Methuselah. Methuselah means when he dies, it will come, something along those lines. When he dies, it will come. And in fact, the flood came in the year of Methuselah's death. So it is interesting, just as a side note, that God, in God's mercy, God gives this prophecy that I'm not going to be patient forever. There will be a flood. There will be a destruction, a retribution for the evil and corruption that has covered the earth. However, he gives the longest living man that name and that prophecy. So this is literally the longest living man is the one that God says, that's the one when he dies, then this judgment will come. Well, so Methuselah is in the line, again, Methuselah is in the line of Seth. He's in the line of the seed of the woman. So Cain is obviously in the line of the seed of the serpent, even though he's not biologically descended from the serpent. We'll get to that in a second. He is obviously spiritually descended from the serpent, which is that he is willing to use power and does use power and violence in order to accomplish his own purposes, even in opposition to the will of God, as opposed to the sons of God, who are those which do the will of God, as Paul says later in the New Testament, that you are a son of God if you do the will of God. That is what it means to be a son of God. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. All right, so Methuselah then has a child. He has a son, and his son's name is Lamech. Okay, so if you're just reading through the genealogies, you might get confused for a second here because you're like, wait a second, I thought we just read about a Lamech, and you did. You read about a Lamech in the line of Cain, but you may not think that it's very weird. Maybe there's just not that many names to choose from, but it should strike you as extremely odd that the son of Methuselah in the line of Seth is named after what had to have been a famously wicked and evil man, Lamech. So you're going, okay, well, how did that happen? Well, you see Naamah, who's not named for any other reason than just being, bright, beautiful woman, the first Kardashian or something, and she's over on the line of Cain. She's in the same generation as Methuselah. So what likely happened, just based on the implicit information there in the genealogy, is that Methuselah married Naamah, or took Naamah as a wife. They had a son that was named after his grandfather on his mother's side, Lamech. Now, at that point, the lines are mixing, and there's a compromise between the lines. Now, God had said that he himself was going to maintain an enmity between them. And so at this point, this is a major problem. And the son of Lamech is Noah, who, of the flood. So that means that God was basically like, this situation is so bad with the mixing of the lines that I'm going to have to reestablish this antithesis through a pretty massive retribution. So after the genealogies where you see this kind of mixing of the lines and the first crisis of compromise and the first crisis of synthesis between the sons of God and the seed of the serpent, or the seeds of the woman and seed of the serpent, you have this very cryptic passage that a lot of people have massively misinterpreted, and it involves the Nephilim, which, if you're looking at apocryphal information, has been posited as half stone or stone, half demon giants who have the spark of angels from being fallen angels or something like that, who then go and, I don't know, like have children with the. Anyway, it's kind of a bizarre and a little bit salacious idea. But in the context, it's not necessary. So the verse, it's in basically, I think it's in Genesis 6, it talks about how the sons of God looked upon the daughters of Adam, that's what it says literally, and saw that they were good, that's what it says literally. Now, sometimes it's translated beautiful, but the word there is tov, good. And it's literally exactly the same language used when Eve looked upon the fruit of the tree and was tempted by it and saw that it was good. It's the exact same Hebrew language. So what you're seeing there is the language of temptation, that the sons of God looked upon the daughters of Adam and saw that they were good, in the same way that Eve looked upon the fruit on the tree and saw that it was good, was tempted by it, took it even though it was forbidden, and consequences that followed were disastrous. Okay, so that's what you're looking at here when you see this idea. Now, a lot of people have looked at that and like, sons of God can only mean angels. First off, that's just not correct. In fact, in the New Testament, it's explicitly mentioned multiple times how human beings are children of God. And the literal there is, huios, sons of God, meaning that you are called a son of God in the New Testament. Behold, what manner the love of the Father has given unto us, that we should be called sons of God. That's mentioned multiple times in the New Testament. But what a lot of people don't realize is that it is also a reality in the Old Testament. It's not as emphasized. But really, like I said, a son of God is anyone, literally anybody, who does the will of God. That's what Paul says. So if you're looking at it, a son of God could be an angel, a son of God could be a human being, but in this context, it's pretty obvious that the sons of God almost certainly refers to the line of Seth. In the context, and within the implicit information in the genealogy, it's pretty obvious that the sons of God, the seed of the woman, the line of Seth, looked upon the Naamah, the beautiful woman that was over here on the other side, on the seed of Cain, right, pleasing to the eye, and took her as his wife, and then had a mixed child that was probably moving in the direction of the seed of the serpent, or at least a synthesis between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, which God had promised that he himself would maintain the enmity between them. And so this is definitely a situation that God is wanting to circumvent. So then you see the flood. The flood comes because the earth is totally, completely covered in corruption. In fact, the language here is absolutely total. I mean, there is no question. It says that the whole earth was filled with violence, and that every thought of every heart was only ever evil continually. That you cannot get more total than that. So a lot of people look at the flood and they're like, wow, that's, overreaction. No, not if what God actually writes in Genesis is accurate. And if you look at that, you can see, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense, actually, that there would be a compromise between them, that the men of renown that were born to these mixed couples. Basically, they had all of the integrity and the strength and the perseverance of the seed of the Seth, but they had all of the ambition and the power hungry and bloodlust of the seed of the serpent. And in that mixture, they created these Nephilim, which are the men of renown, which I also believe are human. So I don't believe that there's any need to bring in the angels sleeping with human women, aside from the fact that I actually don't think that's possible. Because as Jesus says, that angels do not marry or give in marriage. So the idea that an angel and a human being could actually procreate is, I think, absurd and makes no sense. Angels don't have bodies. They are spiritual beings. Now, at the same time, does that mean that angels do not replicate? No, of course they do replicate. That's the whole point. The idea of the seed or child of the serpent. Now, notice, it says seed rather than son, and I think that's a very important distinction, because a seed, as is mentioned in Genesis, is something that reproduces after its kind. So spiritual reproduction is like the reproduction of a seed. It reproduces after its kind. It produces things like it. And if you look at spiritual reproduction in general, especially among spirit of evil, spirits of sin, they tend to, almost like viruses, produce after their kind. So, someone's angry with you, you respond with anger. Somebody is lustful towards you, you're tempted toward lust. Somebody is proud towards you, you're tempted to put them in their place by being proud yourself. The spirit of sin tends to replicate itself in the people that it is up against. And actually, one of the rules of spiritual warfare that I teach my children is recognize that a spirit of sin desires to replicate itself in you. It's a very important precursor to defending yourself against spiritual attack, is this understanding that the spirit desires to use you to replicate itself in the same way that a virus uses your healthy cells in order to replicate itself. So in that sense, that spirits do replicate. They just replicate spiritually according to their kind. So the seed of the serpent is not a biological production. It's not biological procreation. It's spiritual procreation, and such a thing does exist. Now, so the seed of the serpent, you actually see throughout the scriptures. You see that, there's all sorts of hints at it. For instance, even if you look at Goliath, a lot of theologians will talk about how Goliath is pictured as a great serpent. And you notice that David, the Messiah type, crushes the head of Goliath with the stone from the sling. And one of the reasons why Goliath looks like a great serpent is because of the fact that he has nachash armor, bronze armor. The word for serpent, nachash, is also the word for bronze, nachash. And so because the mouth of the serpent was considered to be like bronze, when they open their mouth, you can see that reddish bronze kind of color in there. That's why they think that the words are connected. But one way or the other, the bronze armor, and the word nachash is mentioned over and over again concerning Goliath and his armor and his weaponry and all these kinds of things. And so he's very much connected to a large kind of humongous dragon-like, serpent-like creature that David, in his humility, again, David, the nobody, the shepherd, the youngest of the litter, the one that everybody overlooked that thought was not important, the Chabel, the Abel of Abels here is coming out. Everybody's laughing, thinking, what could you do, to this giant serpent dragon creature? And he crushes the head of the serpent creature, and thereby redeems Israel. So there's all these kind of figures of that kind of replicating and reproducing themselves throughout the Old Testament. But you obviously see in the New Testament a very clear picture of this when Jesus talks to the Pharisees, and they say, he says, you're doing the will of your father. And they say, what are you talking about? Our father is Abraham. We're not bastard children, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, no, you are children of your father, the devil. In other words, he's calling them seed of the serpent. That's what he's calling them. Now, again, they don't have to be biologically. You see what I'm saying? It's really important. They don't have to be they're obviously not biologically the children of demons. He's not saying your mother slept with demons. What he's saying is that the Pharisees are operating in the exact same way as the seed of Cain, operating in terms of power, unwilling to submit themselves to the will of God. Okay, but rather trying to accomplish their own purposes, take things into their own hands, even through deceit and murder, which is exactly what he says to them, that your father, the devil, was a liar and a murderer from the beginning. So deceit and murder are two of the main earmarks of seed of the serpent. All right, so I don't know if that covers that. I hope it does well enough to move on. What do you think, Dan? Is that good enough for the seed of the serpent for the time being? And does that cover the Nephilim for you as well? I'll wait for you on that. Okay. In the meantime, he also asked me about original sin. So I can talk to you a little bit about that. Original sin is a really difficult thing to deal with unless you are Traducian. Now, if you have not already listened to my episode on Nothing Human, where I talk about Traducianism versus creationism. Now, I don't mean creationism in terms of six-day creationism. I mean creationism in terms of the origin of the soul in this context. So, okay, sweet. So Traducianism is the idea that the spiritual content of your person is generated naturally through the interpolation of your mother and father. So basically through the natural generation of your mother and father, their souls actually join together in a similar way that their bodies join together in terms of the genetic crapshoot that produces you. There's also a sort of like spiritual genetics. Okay, so Traducians would say then that it's not just the genetics of their bodies that produce children, it's also the genetics of their souls that produce children. And that children are the product, both spirit and body, of their parents. Creationists, in terms of the origin of the soul, would say that the soul is created out of nothing at the moment of conception, that the bodies are naturally generated, but that the spirit is something that's given to each individual child at the point of conception. I am Traducian. I am firmly Traducian. I think creationism makes absolutely no sense whatsoever for reasons that I talk about in that podcast episode. But Traducianism also makes original sin really easy to understand. In the same way that you have the inheritance of genetics, which we could trace back, in their selections over time, all the way back to Adam, you would also be able to trace back an inheritance of soul all the way back to Adam. Now, this is made really clear in Genesis, actually, when it talks about how Adam had Seth, and it says that Seth was in the image of Adam, in the likeness and image of Adam. The language that's used there is exactly the same language that was used in discussing the creation of Adam in the image and likeness of God. Meaning that whereas Adam was created in the image and likeness of God, now his children, in some sense, spiritually speaking, are in his image and likeness. And this is obviously not just a material reality. There's historical, probably all of you have anecdotal evidence even personally, of the way that you find different traits, tics, proclivities, and personality traits in your children or yourself that were in your mom and your dad, even if your children or their children didn't even know your mom or your dad. And it's like, how did they get that tic? How did they get that personality trait? How did they get that proclivity? If not through some kind of weird thing, because they weren't nurtured into it. And that's the case with twins and that are separated at birth and all sorts of things like that. Adopted children who end up having similar sin patterns as their parents, even though they're raised in a totally different environment. This is it makes a lot of sense, actually. It just makes a huge amount of sense. So in that sense, or I would say original sin is not just the guilt, the debt that we incurred by the fall of humankind, which there is a debt that was incurred. And people would be like, well, that's not just. It totally is just. I mean, like currently the debt on the United States is like 37 trillion or 20. I don't know what, it's like 40 trillion or something. It's going up so fast and inflating our money so fast. I can't even fathom how fast it is. And I don't even know where it's at right now. I guess I could look up the national debt clock. But anyway, that's still your debt. It's your debt. Even if your grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents or whoever else are all dead and everybody that spent that money isn't even around, you still owe it. So that's that, and that's important to understand. Like, you still owe money, even if you weren't the one who spent it. And that's kind of the thing, is that in some sense, Adam incurred a debt for humanity that now we all are settled with. That's one part of original sin, the debt, and Jesus paid for that. The other part of it, though, is that there's actually an inheritance that we have from Adam, in a spiritual inheritance we have from Adam that's passed down from our parents, that got it from their parents, that got it from their parents. And it's a specific selected spiritual inheritance, in the same way that my physical traits are specifically selected, right? So, okay. So I just want to say, okay. Cool. All right, I'm looking at my comments here, and I've got Lisa saying, please comment on, quote, the promises to you and your children down through their generations in the context of Traducianism. Okay, I will. And then also the promise was so much greater, and by the Creator to his creation. Dirt. Correct. Okay. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So the Traducianism helps to explain how the original sin would have been passed down. The promise, though, that's given, now the question, and this is beautiful because it ties directly into the seed, all right? So the promise is to you and your seed, is actually what he says, down through their generations to Abraham. Paul makes a big deal out of the fact that that's singular, so he says that it was fulfilled ultimately in the singular Jesus. But I also think it's a big deal because it's that same principle we were talking about before, a spiritual progeny, not a biological progeny. Because again, just like you can have a seed of the serpent without physical generation, without procreation, you can have a seed of Abraham without being a biological son of Abraham, which Paul makes very clear when he talks about, I mean, Jesus does too, when he says, if you were sons of Abraham, you would do what Abraham did. You would believe in me because he also looked to my day, right? And they say, oh, well, I mean, you're not even yet 30 years old, and yet you're saying Abraham, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, before Abraham was, I am, and they're all like, blasphemy, stone him. Okay, so anyway, the idea there is that you can be a child of Abraham through faith, and that the promise, obviously, to God, from God to Abraham, has at least that reality, that ultimately is fulfilled in Jesus as Abraham's singular seed, that it is also fulfilled in those who believe like Abraham believed in his faith, and that it is also, there also was a blessing to Abraham's biological children and his biological progeny, as was made clear to, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all of their children, and the way that God maintained his chesed, his covenant faithfulness to them throughout their generations, in spite of the fact that they also inherited, obviously, the sins of their parents, and very obviously, like, it's kind of crazy when you look at them and it's just like, man, you guys are just sinning the same sins over and over again. And but the promise to us, and the promise through Abraham, and the promise as it was fulfilled in Jesus, obviously is so much greater than the debt that we incurred in Adam, and I think that that's made clear in the New Testament. So that's for now what I have to say about original sin. There's probably more that could be said. I think that Traducianism, though, is really helpful in understanding original sin. And if there's anything else that you guys want to talk about in terms of that, you can let me know. I also wanted to talk about another question, totally unrelated. Okay, so unless you guys have anything, you guys and gals have anything particularly on this topic, I'm going to go over and look at Lisa, who's here on the chat. She gave me a question on my Patreon. So this is a good little segue. Hey, if you're not already part of my Patreon, here's me looking at you in the camera. If you're not already part of my Patreon, you should be. Okay, that's it. All right, because my family could use the support. I would like for this to be my sole ministry, teaching. I would like to be able to make a living from teaching, and I currently can't do that. So anything you can do to help me, that'd be great. And Lisa's already on Patreon, and because of that, she sends me chats and questions and stuff like that. So here's one of them that she has, and I'm going to read it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. She says, this isn't a request. Okay, just thoughts that need someplace to go, and if you have a response, I'd love to read it. Okay. I'm thinking about the Renew the Arts podcast about fiction, which I just released, and if you haven't listened to it, you should go listen to it. I talk about the uses and abuse of fiction. She says, specifically the part about the role of imagination in understanding the truth. Our intellects love pattern recognition, and will see patterns and tell stories about how those patterns arose. Many times the stories are not accurate. but we can get into a groove from the repetition of the story to ourself and so fall into confirmation bias. The remedy you suggest for the individual is humility and open-mindedness. Those qualities will help us most quickly apprehend the new puzzle piece and fit a new story that is closer to the truth. But what about others who are telling themselves a story that isn't true? And she says, I think you'd advise against trying to correct people in most circumstances, but let's say the consequences of the error are very dire and or the relationship is such that the correction of the false story is appropriate. For most people, it is best to appeal to either affections or will, I guess. Maybe tell a story or recall a memory or paint a vision, analogies. You're right that this feels weaker than it probably is. Okay. So I don't know where she got the impression that I would advise against trying to correct people. I would advise that you should correct them wisely. I think that directly, and I think talking to them directly and arguing with them directly is not going to do a whole lot oftentimes. And especially if you're thinking, oh, I can just have a rational argument and they're going to receive it rationally. The reality, as we've talked about within the three powers, is that most people are not rational. So, and that's not a problem either. People would be like, yeah, that's the problem. No, you're not rational either, more than likely. Most people are not. Most people come to conclusions on the basis of what they think is good or right, and not necessarily on the basis of what they think is true. And that's not necessarily a problem. As long as you're focused on Jesus, you'll eventually end up in the same place and you'll be open to the truth. But the truth is hard for people to accept usually in its most, direct, most straightforward form. Okay, most people don't want it. It's painful. So maybe stories. Yeah, and people definitely do tell themselves stories that are false. So I understand what Lisa is saying, and there are a bunch of different things that I could say about this. But if a person wants to believe a story, and let's call it a fantasy, the issue is there is true fiction and there's false fiction, and oftentimes false fiction is oriented in establishing something you want to believe is true, but that isn't actually true. And here's an unfortunate reality. For most people, they actually have to experience the consequences of that fantasy in its destructive form before they're able to be open to hearing a different story. Because a lot of people, the reason they believe false stories is because there's something in it that they want in the short term. But the nice thing about folly is that it's unsustainable. So eventually, it is the case that, in some ways, I would say you pray and you ask God to bring those circumstances into their life that open their eyes to the destructiveness of the lies that they've believed in. Because in the Old Testament particularly, but in the New Testament as well, lies have to do with something not following through in some way or another. So, I talk about it in my new book a little bit, and I'll do podcasts on it. But in the scriptures, lies are much less oriented around facts than they are about what they're actually accomplishing or what they're actually producing in the world. And so there are two different kinds of lies that are generally called unfaithfulnesses or falsehoods. And Lisa knows this because she's read the draft of my book. But one of the kinds of lies is called kazav, and it's where you posit something as having substance when it doesn't. When it doesn't have substance. The other is called kahash, and it's where you suppress something that does have substance as if it doesn't have substance. Okay, so it's sort of like the inverse of each other. There's one kazav where you're saying this is true, and this is something that can be relied upon, even though it can't be relied upon. And then there's another form of lie, the kahash, where you say, like the first instance of this is where Sarah hears the message where God says that, you'll have a son now and you'll name him, eventually name him Isaac. And she laughs. She's like, how can I have a son, And she laughs and God comes to her and he's like, why did you laugh? And she said, and it says in the text, she kahashed and said, I did not laugh. So she's actually rejecting or suppressing the truth. She's saying that that's something that did have substance did not have substance. So that's a kahash. Okay, so those two things in both of those cases, some of the only ways, for instance, that a kazav, which is mostly what Lisa's talking about here, a story you've told yourself that you think has weight that doesn't really have weight, one of the only ways that ever is proven to be false is when you put your weight on it and it doesn't hold. So some of what will happen is, yes, tell them true stories. Yes, be there. But also, I would say the most important thing for people who firmly believe in a fantasy is to pray fervently that God would open their eyes to the destructive consequences of that fantasy, and Lord willing, in God's grace and mercy, that He opens their eyes to it before those consequences are irreversible or incontrovertible. And that's really hard to do. But I have a picture in my office of Monica, the mother of Augustine, and she is a reminder to me. My daughter Amity drew it in colored pencil, and Monica prayed for Augustine for his whole life. He didn't become a believer until like his 30s or something like that. So for 30 or so years, Augustine said that he would walk by his mom's room and see her on her knees, like crying out to God for Augustine. Like for decades, she did this, and he was lost. He was so lost, and telling himself false stories. And she didn't rebuke him all that much. He knew what she believed, and he knew what she wanted to happen with him. But mostly she just spent her time on her knees in prayer, fervently asking God to open Augustine's eyes, which of course eventually God did. And Augustine writes about this in his autobiography. And I think because of her faithfulness in many ways, one of the greatest theologians that has ever lived, I think was brought to Jesus. I mean, I know, sovereignty and all that, but Monica was an instrument that God used particularly in her prayers and her faithfulness toward her son. And so anyway, that would be my first recommendation. I know that's not, again, it's not really glamorous or easy, but, get on your knees and pray that God would open their eyes and show them how the destructive consequences of these fantasies. And oftentimes that happens through circumstances, the things that they put their feet on to rely on, they end up wily coyoteing, and realize they look down and there's nothing underneath. And you just pray that there's something soft underneath them when they fall. And that when they get there, they don't just climb back up there and do it again. All right, so that's what I have to say to that. It's not maybe a very satisfying answer, but that's about the best I can give you for now. I'll think about it more, though. The last question, Dan says, why was there even a temptation to sin? I don't know exactly what you mean by that, Dan. But I'm going to assume that what you mean is, if you are perfect and without sin, then how could you be tempted to sin in that state? Thanks for answering, but you're welcome, Lisa. Thanks for asking, and thanks for being so sweet. Okay, so I talk about this briefly in an article that I wrote about the temptation of Satan, because I think that the fall of Satan is a little bit more of a question, honestly. The issue of the fall of humankind kind of depends on the fall of Satan, because if you're, according to the New Testament, Eve was deceived, and for Eve, well, Eve was deceived, it says very clearly. So she was deceived, and Adam was not deceived, interestingly, but he went down for Eve. He chose Eve over righteousness, as many men do. It's very easy to choose a naked woman over righteousness, and that's what Adam did. And so, anyway, the issue of Satan, I think, is a more central question. I'll get to the issue of that she didn't know sin or evil. She did, in a sense, know evil. If you define evil in my terms as far as like a harm, because as soon as God made a single law of withholding any good, there was evil, at least theoretically, to her. She would know it. It was the smallest amount. I mean, honestly, if you're talking about the spectrum of good and evil, okay, I'm going to put my hands up here so you can see. Okay, so spectrum of good and evil, right? Okay, so over on this side, on the all the way good, you have like fullness of life, abundance of life, right? And all the way over here, you have, oh man, this is crazy. You have death, ultimate death, like second death, right? Well, somewhere in, this area, you end up having the withholding of good. Okay, so it's like the first movement from good over into evil is the withholding of a good. So when God made the law, concerning the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, these are material terms. It's not the knowledge of righteousness and wickedness. This is the knowledge of good and evil. So the tree itself was a training in the difference and the distinction between good and evil. When Adam and Eve were first created, they would not have known evil. They only would have known good. God was good, and God had made a very good world, and there was no death, there was no suffering, there was no pain. So they would not have known any evil. As soon as God withheld a single tree's fruit from them, that was the smallest possible evil that they could endure. And what God was teaching them is that righteousness is beyond good and evil. Meaning that you cannot have righteousness simply by choosing what gives life and rejecting what gives death, because there are many times when righteousness requires pain. There are many times when righteousness requires withholding of good. There are many times when righteousness requires fasting, and it's not a good enough a rule. I mean, I've talked to my kids about this. Like, the reality is that if you only use good and evil, meaning pleasure or pain, as your guiding metric for what to do, whether you should do this or that, then you're easy to control. I mean, anybody with a stick and a carrot can lead you wherever they want you to go. In order to transcend the reality of animal to the reality of human, you have to be beyond, ultimately, the carrot and the stick. You have to gain the freedom of righteousness, which is able to choose within good and evil based on God's will. And God sometimes wills that you do that which is painful, both either to you or to other people. For instance, you know, if you have a righteous execution, or a just war, or you take antibiotics, or you kill an animal and eat it, all of these they do harm to living things, but I would say that they can be permissible. But if you're like the Jainites or whatever, who it's a Hindu sect, and they put coverings over their mouths so that they don't inhale gnats, and they make sure that they never step on bugs, and they only eat fruit that's fallen from trees. They won't even remove the fruit because that itself is a violence. So these people are like dedicated to only ever doing good, but the reality is you couldn't even live like that. They barely do. So you can look up that. But for the most part, everybody understands that the world inevitably requires some distribution of good and evil, meaning that there is some distribution of pain, some distribution of pleasure that has to be organized according to a law. In fact, if you were to ask me what my definition of a law is a distribution of good or evil. That's what it is. Because, for instance, if you're talking about the law of like private property, what you're saying is that this good belongs to this person in this context and not to these other people. And so it's a distribution of goods. In the prohibition against murder is different than the prohibition against killing. You're not saying you are never allowed to kill. You're saying that there's a distribution of the evil of killing. It's allowed in these circumstances. It's not allowed in these other circumstances. So in order to get to the point of righteousness, you have to go beyond good and evil. I hope that's clear enough. And God was training Adam and Eve in the smallest training wheels kind of way with the knowledge of good and evil in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because it was a single one withholding of good. In fact, he says, all the other trees, I command you, eat them, eat of them, eat all their fruit. But this one tree, seriously, just one little tree, don't eat of that fruit. And so that was a training in righteousness, because what they had to say is, even though the tree is good, this good is not permitted to me. And that is a very weird situation for a person who only ever knows good to experience. This idea of like, wait a second, there's a good that isn't permitted to me. It's a totally new concept, and God is gently leading them in it. And I think that he would have led them further into it over time if they had passed that first test. They didn't even pass the first test. The reason they didn't pass the first test is because Satan basically came to the woman first through the serpent and convinced the woman through the serpent that ultimately laws should be based on good and evil for you now. Meaning, if it's good for you now, how could it be wrong? And he's been using that same argument ever since. And tons of people believe it. Feels so good, how could it be wrong? Well, because lots of good things are wrong. if they're not permissible to you. And lots of harmful things and painful things are actually quite salutary and necessary for your growth and development in righteousness. And so you can't really use pain or pleasure as a rule for righteousness. And that's what God was trying to lead them in. They failed in that. Okay, the reason they failed is that Eve was deceived, and then Adam said, I'm not willing to let go of my wife. And I think probably he was given the opportunity right then and there, in a sense. What if he had just said, you know what, my wife has sinned, my wife has failed, she deserves to die, kill me instead, take me instead. I think God would have taken that bargain, and I think Adam would have been raised from the dead, and then that would have been Jesus. So, because his bride right then and there would have been saved by his willingness to die for her sake. But instead, he went with her. He failed. Anyway, but the real thing is you go back to, worked on me today with 2 ice creams. Yes. Yeah, no, it does. It does work. Okay. So the real question, though, is how did Satan, who's created in a perfect world? So I wrote an article about it. I recommend that you read it, that you check it out at some point. But basically, I'll give it to you in a nutshell here, since you're all here. So when Satan was created, there's a question of like, when was Satan created? He existed not eternally. So there was a moment when he was made. And so you ask, like, when? When were the angels created? There's lots of different answers on this theologically. But I think that, and I make a case in my article so you can read it, and I have all my receipts there if you're looking for scripture references and stuff like that. But I believe that the creation of the angels was on the same day as the creation of the stars, because the angels are regularly connected to the stars, almost as if the stars are their material domains. They don't have bodies. But in a sense, the heavens, the host of the heavens, which is sometimes mentioned as the stars, sometimes mentioned as the angels, there's a mysterious connection between the stars and the angels. So I believe they were created on the same day as the stars, which means that Satan would have been created on the 4th day of creation, which is the day that the stars were created. If my theory is correct, which I think it's pretty ironclad. You can check it out in my article. But that means that when he was created, he was truly, as the head of the angels and the head of the host of heaven, he would have been, circumstantially, the pinnacle of creation. So on the 4th day, when he was created, circumstantially, he was the pinnacle of creation. On the 5th day, when God created fish and birds, I'm sure that Satan wasn't thinking, my status as pinnacle of creation is currently being threatened by birds or fish or whatever. I think he probably would have thought, yeah, these are amazing creations of God, but they're still under me. I am still a pinnacle and the ruler of creation. And then you have the land animals that were created on the 6th day at the beginning, of the creepy crawlies and all that. Again, I'm sure he's like, wow, this is even more impressive than fish and birds, with all the land animals and mammals and stuff like that, elephants and stuff like that. But still, not as great as me. I'm still the pinnacle of creation. But when humankind is created on the 6th day, something very strange happens, because God says that he has made humankind in his likeness, in his image, like him, which is not something he said concerning the angels. The angels are not created like God. They are not created in the image of God. So that right there is kind of weird as far as the angels are concerned. They're like, wait a second, how come these flesh creatures, how come these dust balls get to be made in your image, and we, your spiritual creatures here as your host in heaven, do not? That would have been already kind of weird. But then God actually gave dominion over the cosmos, as it says in the Psalms. He gave dominion of the cosmos, meaning the universe, to human beings, to Adam particularly. And at that moment, circumstance changed So it's important to understand that temptation, the word for temptation in the New Testament is parasmos, and the word for trial or test in the New Testament is the same word. So test and temptation and are the same word. They're the same word, parasmos, in Greek in the New Testament. Sometimes it's translated test. Sometimes it's translated temptation. So, for instance, if you're looking at God and James and says God does not test anyone, the word there parasmos, or he does not tempt anyone. The word parasmos is the same. It's really interesting because that same exact word is what's used to talk about Satan as the great tempter, right? So Satan could be translated the great tester, but usually translated the great tempter. Whereas God does not tempt anyone, but then in the Septuagint, the word parasmos is used to talk about how God tests Abraham, for instance, when he asked him to offer Isaac on Mount Moriah. So when you're looking at that, it's like, well, God tests, Satan tempts, but the word is the same, and the circumstances are the same. Meaning that the circumstances, like for instance, God tested Job through Satan's temptation. So the circumstances are the same. It's God's test, but it's Satan's temptation. The difference is that God is not desiring for people to sin. God is not desiring for people to fail. He is in fact desiring through the test to refine them, purify them, and bring them into a state of righteousness. Satan, on the other hand, does desire for them to fail. He does desire for them to be destroyed because he hates them. Why does he hate them? Because there was a time when he was the pinnacle of creation, and when human beings were created, that status altered immediately, and he was not able to deal with that change in circumstance. So what that means is that for day 4, day 5, Satan is there. He's the pinnacle of creation. It's possible, and this is speculative, but I think this, if you think about it, you'll probably follow me on this, that you probably know people where you're like, if the circumstance wasn't available to them to do a particular sin, they wouldn't have. So for instance, you might know like a man who's like it's like if the circumstance presented itself, that some woman that wasn't his wife came and was trying to tempt him into committing adultery, maybe he would, right? But as long as that circumstance is not available, he doesn't. Does that make him a righteous man? No, not really, because you're like, well, he hasn't been tested. Like if that temptation came and he were to resist it, then you say, well, that's righteousness, right? So in a sense, but you couldn't say that he had sinned yet. You wouldn't yet call him an adulterer because it hasn't happened. He hasn't done it because the circumstances are not such that he would. So if you're thinking the main sin of Satan is pride, at what point is he actually tested in pride? If he's able to maintain his status as pinnacle of creation for all of eternity, does he never rebel against God? Possibly. As long as he's able to be, the head for all of eternity, maybe he never rebels. Maybe he's content to be on top of everything. But as soon as God puts him in a position where he has to submit himself in humility to the service of humankind, which note this, all the angels who stayed on board with God's plan submitted themselves to service to humankind, which is insane. Because it would have made more sense before humankind fell. But think about how the angels are just up there like, are you sure, God? You want us to serve these guys? Right? And I'm sure that there were a lot of angels who, when Satan came along and said, why should we serve them? In fact, I'm going to prove to you how bad a decision you made, God, to make them pinnacle of creation. I'm going to show you how frail, how weak, how totally fallible they are. And he did. He came down and he deceived Eve and he ruined things and he, exercised his dominion. And then a lot of the angels agreed with him and came with him. And they started to exercise their dominion over humankind as well, even though it wasn't their proper place. And that's part of why, the worship of false gods is mentioned multiple times as the worship of demons. It's mentioned by Moses, it's mentioned by Paul. The worship of demons is oftentimes, the worship of idols like Molech or any of these major gods that you see. More than likely, those actually were demons. Now, and that makes sense of ancient worship practices, because why would they worship something and give up their children and sacrifice all that they sacrificed if they weren't actually, getting something out of it, or at least avoiding some horrendous evil, right? And we look back at that, we can't really understand that world because Jesus broke that world. He destroyed that world. He triumphed over the powers of darkness. He cast them out. He bound Satan. And so the world of fear that the ancients lived in terms of the dominion of demons, is not the world we live in. And so when we look back at the ancients and say, oh, these superstitious guys who believed in all these dark spirits around every corner, maybe it was because there were dark spirits around every corner and Jesus banished them, and we can all be grateful and thankful for that. And instead of considering ourselves, more sophisticated or less superstitious than the ancients. Anyway, that's one way of reading it. So anyway, Satan fell because of pride. He was not willing to submit himself to service to the supremacy of humankind. And in his fall, he decided that he was going to destroy, in his rebellion, he was going to destroy humankind. He hates us. He desires to see us destroyed. And he desires to rule over us, even if the ruling over us is to his own destruction ultimately. He is unwilling to submit himself to the will of God in those terms. And so the temptation occurred because for those 2 days he was in a circumstance where he could be created righteous in a state of supremacy, but could not maintain that righteousness in a state of humility. And that is why he fell, in my opinion. I hope that makes sense. There's a lot more to it also that's really interesting, because the archangel now is Michael, which is my name, and Michael in Hebrew is Michael, which literally means who is like God. And it's interesting that God would make, whether he had that name in the first place or whether he got that name when he became the leader of God's armies who warred against Satan and Satan's minions. It is a really interesting name that he has, because Michael is, it's not Asher Chel, which would mean the one who is like God. It actually is Michael, which is it's an interrogative. It is actually a question. Who is like God? It's a question mark. Who's like God? And it's a taunt. It's a taunt. Because you can imagine that Michael, leading the armies of God against Satan, his name is a rebuke and a taunt to Satan. Who is like God? And Satan would, the answer to it, a lot of people go, well, the answer to that is no one. Well, actually, that's not the answer to it. There's somebody like God. There's somebody made like God in his image and in his likeness. There's someone like God. Who is it? Oh, it's human beings. So Michael's name, in some sense, is a taunt to Satan. He hears the name and he's like, who is like God? It's human beings again. And not you, Satan. You are not like God. And eventually, as we know, and a lot of people think that human beings are always going to be under angels. They're not. They're not naturally inferior to angels. They're naturally superior to angels. They were given the supremacy over the cosmos, including angels, and angels are ministering servants, spirits of service to humankind, because they're actually in submission to our authority in those terms. Now, obviously, for a little while, we're lower than the angels because of our sin and fallenness, but in Jesus Christ, understand that Satan got a far worse bargain than he thought. Because human beings used to be just the pinnacle of creation, just the vice regents of the cosmos. Now there's a human being sitting at the right hand of God in heaven. So his gambit was foolish. he actually made the situation in such that human beings achieved a greater status through redemption than they would have achieved if we had never fallen. Okay, so is this the dumbing down of sin from the days of Noah? Are you referring to the 1,000 years? Well, the millennium in Revelation is a different thing. And in the next live stream, I promise you, I will talk to you about the interpretation of prophecy. Because I had a really long conversation with somebody about the interpretation of prophecy. And I think that it would be helpful for a lot of people to hear it. So I will talk about the 1,000 years, the millennium, Revelation, and the interpretation of prophecy, because there's some principles of the interpretation of prophecy that I think massively help to clarify things when it comes to reading prophetic books. And I think a lot of people are just confused when they're reading prophetic books. So I will talk about that. The dumbing down of sin from the days of Noah. Well, in terms of like the evil that in corruption and violence that covered the entire earth in the days of Noah, the flood dealt with at least the initial version of that. But obviously, the seed of the serpent still existed in Canaan, in terms of the spiritual progeny, and in Ham and in Canaan, particularly in Canaan. And Canaan, and again, Canaan is sort of that idea of the serpent, because it's the squatter in the garden, and the people of Israel are called to exterminate that serpent finally from the Garden of Eden, which is the land of promise, flowing with milk and honey. So I'll talk about that at a certain point. I don't know if that answers your question, Dan. But I think that's probably about good for now. It's been about an hour, and that's what I want these to be generally. I don't want to go on too long. But I think that's good. So thank you so much for listening in. This went a lot better. I hope it did. I mean, I'm not on your end of it, so I don't know how well it went in terms of anything. But it at least on my end, I don't think I had major failures of the internet like I did 2 weeks ago. So, yeah. All right. I don't know if I'll link my Patreon here, but I can send you a link, Dan, at some point. But yeah, you can find my Patreon on my website. On any of my podcasts is the first link in the link section, michaelminkoff.com or nothinghumanpodcast.com. But yeah, you can also look up Michael Minkoff Jr. on Patreon and find me that way too. But yeah, anybody who wants to just send me questions or whatnot, I'll anywhere. Seriously, you can write questions on any of my podcast episodes. That would be really helpful for me. I love answering questions and helping people get clarity about all these various different kinds of issues. So, thank you so much for being here, everybody. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks. I'm going to do this every other Wednesday for the foreseeable future. And I'll probably do it like this here at my parents' house, where the internet apparently is working. All right. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you later.